This is the third and final video in this short series on how to use sources in the Homeric World topic. If you haven't watched the first two parts, I suggest you go back to part 1 now. How about clothing? Now, this is interesting because we don't get any real evidence of clothing that's actual pieces of clothing because it just doesn't last over this amount of time. What we do have is evidence for the kind of things that they might have been using as dyes. This from things that we know are still used as dyes or would have been around at that time or that were imported. So we've got yellow, you can make that from onion skins, but also saffron, which we know that they had. Red, which you can get from insect eggs and the plant madder. Blue, indigo, a plant, and again this is a dye rather than a paint. And purple, again shellfish, ink, similar to the kind of stuff that they would use later on in the classical world. So we get the idea of colours potentially being used in clothing. We've also got evidence from the frescoes. Now, this is another prescribed source, the fresco of a lady holding a necklace, and we can see the colours making up her tight-fitting bodice, red and yellow and white. And these echo the colours in her jewellery and in the pieces of fabric perhaps that are in her hair. So we get an idea of what the clothing looks like and also the colours of the clothing, which seems to match with the dyes evidence. Here is another piece of evidence, again showing a woman with the whiteness being used to suggest that this is a woman of high status who doesn't go outside, or a goddess. This is a painter-plastered head of a woman from the cult centre in Mycenae, or what is believed to be the cult centre because this head was found in it. And this woman also has very interesting decoration on her face that we don't actually see on the frescoes of women, where she's actually got additional, aside from the makeup around her eyes, we've got these little sun patterns in red on her chin and her cheeks and her forehead. Although the curls of hair and the headband and the eye makeup are very similar to the fresco. So is this part of the clothing? This is fashion. Is that what she wears in her hair? Is that what she wears on her face? Then we've got evidence from the graves of the jewellery found with the bodies from these. These particular pieces of gold were found in the shaft graves. These were found in shaft grave 5 from grave circle A Mycenae. There's a massive wealth of gold here. We've got long thin pieces that possibly were wrapped around the head like diadems or belts, and we've also got these small pieces. Look at those tiny little octopuses in the top left. These seem to have been connected to the clothing. Now maybe that's just for burial. That's a limitation of this evidence, although maybe these were for decoration of high status people. Perhaps they wore these in life as well as in death. More evidence for clothing. Here are the Linear B ideograms, and you can see that the ideograms for cloth and garment and armour, in fact, look very similar to what we see on the other pieces of evidence. So cloth, that appears to be, in fact, a loom. So we know the cloth is woven. We see that from later on in the classical world. The Linear B symbol for garment does seem to be like a skirt from one of the frescoes with its individual sections and then arm pieces. And then armour is actually very similar to the dendra armour. I know that's armour rather than clothing, but I forgot to put it on here earlier on. So this, interestingly, is a source suggesting that the ideograms are images of the things that they are depicting. So the clothing may well have looked just like this, and this is also how they made this clothing, by weaving. How about trade? Now, for trade, we can look at the items that they had, which probably weren't from around where they lived. So gold. They had some gold in Greece, but in fact they had to import a lot of it, and it may have come from Macedonia, Egypt, and Thassos, which is a Greek island. Amber for beads may well have come as far from Denmark in northern Europe. Ivory would have come from Africa or possibly Syria. Lapis lazuli gemstones from possibly Africa, along with silver and lead from Attica, the area around Athens. Copper, which they need to use with tin in order to make bronze. That copper might have also come from Attica or also Syria or Cyprus or Sardinia, areas rich in it. Ostrich eggshells, which we found in the Uluburun shipwreck, would have probably come from Africa. Tin, again needed to make bronze, from Britain in fact, from Turkey, from Afghanistan and from Spain. And glass, not for windows of course, but in beads and small vessel, possibly from Egypt. These are also backed up by the Uluburun shipwreck contents, where we have 10 tons of copper and 1 ton tin, which I believe is the ratio you need in order to make bronze. There's also 150 Middle Eastern style jars. These jars are not only imported because they're different to the kind of vessel that you'd find in Mycenae, but also because they contain useful things like resin, olives and glass beads. The majority of these jars seem to be full of olives, so even though you'd think, well, olives are something you find in Greece, they're importing them. We do that, don't we? We like to find rare versions of our everyday things, like we eat a lot of cheese, but we might eat a lot of very specialist cheeses. Wooden logs, elephant tusks, hippopotamus teeth, tortoise shells, oil lamps, pottery, amber, drinking cups, nuts, olives and spices, a trumpet, and wooden tablets. All of these were found in this Mycenaean ship off the coast of Turkey. Now, all of these things might have come from round the Mediterranean and further abroad. Now, that's not to say that this ship went further abroad than that, like all the places listed on the previous bit of evidence. But there may have been this interconnected trade route. And so, just like today, getting rare things could be quite exciting. Things like elephant tusks would have been used for ivory. And things like the ostrich eggs, we actually see in I think it's Grave Circle B, some vessels made from ostrich eggs. So there certainly is a lot of trade going on. Other evidence is this beautiful piece of ivory sculpture found at Mycenae on the slope of the Acropolis. It depicts 2 women and a child. They seem to be wearing the very tiered skirts and close-fitting bodices that we see in the frescoes. I've only shown you one fresco so far, but you have seen others most likely. And we can see here very, very detailed carving. So there's a very fine craftsmanship going on in this piece of ivory. It's a very small item. The fine detail on it, as well as its material, suggests it was an imported piece because it seems to depict Mycenaean women. So again, what is the source? How might that source have been used? What does it depict, or what is in the source in this case? Can we support it with other sources? And what are the limitations of these sources? Hopefully by now, this list of how to use these sources is being drummed into your brain, so you'll be able to apply it to anything that you see. Now, the Linear B tablets are rather a source in themselves, but let's discuss them briefly, even though I have done another video on this. First, the fact that there are Linear B syllables that connect together to make words, and Linear B ideograms that then represent those words, and that the words themselves found on the tablets link, in fact, to ancient Greek. That tells us that these Linear B tablets can be deciphered, and the words on them give us information directly about what was in these places where these tablets are found, Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos. Also, the prescribed source tablet that we are given, tablet 641, actually not Mycenaean but found in the Pylos archive room, has a very long list of items. It seems to be an inventory. This is the middle tablet that smaller tablets would have been used to copy information from one tablet to the other on. So this is a nice long list. And the part of it that's most important is where it says tiripode in syllables, and then it's followed up by an ideogram of a tripod, which tiripode means. So we've got this idea that they wrote words followed by symbols. That's going to help people perhaps who cannot actually read the word decipher what is on the Linear B tablet, but also perhaps is a shorthand. Here, if you look at the tablet again, you can see the ideograms really clearly. Maybe that's sort of telling you where bits of information on tripods is, bits of information on jars and so forth is, and goblets. So overall, these sources are tablets themselves. They were pieces of information kept on clay for short periods of time. Possibly they depict lists of inventories, things that are actually owned there. So it tells us what is physically there at the time, but the limitations are that we don't know when that time was, or exactly what these things were for, or why they kept them. Some of them seem to be damaged, for example. A tripod cauldron on one foot with a single handle. Why are you holding on to that? Is it because it's bronze? That's also not necessarily listed there. So there are some limitations to these sources. Another piece of evidence for the Linear B tablets is the fact that they were kept in archive rooms. Now, this is a reconstruction of an illustration which actually comes from the cover of the Mycenaean World, a 1976 book by John Chadwick, illustrated by Henry Hankey. And this image seems to suggest that we have scribes. One is sitting and writing on a tablet, which we can see in his hand. Another scribe is perhaps reading out what he has seen so that the second scribe can write it down. And then another person is actually making the tablet. If you want to know more about how the tablets are made, I highly recommend looking at Dr. Anna P. Judson's videos on the topic on the British School at Athens website. In the background, you can see baskets full of tablets. We know that tablets were kept in baskets because, in fact, the impression of basket weave is often found on the back of these accidentally fired tablets. And through the doorway, we can see yet more shelves with baskets of tablets, suggesting that, in fact, there were lots and lots of these kept, even if for a short period, because they weren't originally fired. They would have been left and they would just fall to nothing after 6 months or so. We also look at the pieces of evidence that are the tablets themselves, the fact that they are long and thin and would fit in the palm of your hand. So therefore collecting individual pieces of information that then might be copied onto longer leaf tablets like the one that is our prescribed source. So again, what is the source? What has been used to create the source? What does that source depict? What does the source tell us? And what are the limitations of these sources? I mean, the picture here, the limitation is it's an illustration from 1976. It only is based on what we know about tablets to create an idea of how they were made, so we can't take that as fact. The Linear B tablet itself is a tablet, but it has its own limitations. Where were these 12 spears, for example? So lastly, we've got some information that is found on the Linear B tablets, some of which I've already shown you, other things I haven't. So here, these are all bits of information. They're not necessarily from one individual tablet. These are collections of information. So they've been collected into things mentioned on Pylos tablets. It seems to suggest they're going to war, or perhaps they're expecting people to attack. Things mentioned on Knossos tablets, which seem to be an inventory of what's in the kitchens perhaps at this time, or perhaps they're making an inventory of stuff they need to keep because they're predicting that they will be besieged soon. There's also people doing specific jobs, as we looked at previously, and evidence from tablets of positions in society. So the fact that all of these pieces of information are listed on tablets tells us that they were important for some reason at some point, but we don't know what point that was, and we don't know when this information comes from. We can just take it as a snapshot of what was happening in the Mycenaean period, towards the end of the period at least. So if we think about life in the Mycenaean age, some practice tasks. Have a go at practicing the following. Pause this page and have a look. Think about how you would answer these questions. The same for decorative arts. Here are some decorative art practice tasks, and we haven't looked at decorative arts here, but again, this is an idea of how to treat the sources that you've been given. And finally, the tombs, graves and burial practice tasks. Have a go at doing the following. Using the information that you've been given, think how many sources that you've looked at can you use to support your argument. I hope this has been a useful video in getting you to think about sources and how to use them, and has also introduced you to perhaps some new sources that you haven't yet seen. Don't forget, do some research of your own and even visit the sites and the museums if you can. Thank you so much for listening, and do like and subscribe so that you don't miss any other videos on this topic.